Very special thanks to Primoris 4x4, based in Long Compton. As always, I've linked to their website and current stock down in the video description. They are by trade more of a Land Rover specialist, but as you can tell from this episode, they have some pretty nice specialty vehicles in there as well, and who knows, if you're watching this video close enough to the time of its release, you might even be able to still grab this Aston. So click on the link down below, check out their current stock, and if you're in that part of the country, they might just have what you're looking for. As I've mentioned in a couple of other installments of Beards and Cars, one of my absolute favourite things when I review a high-performance vehicle in particular is when it can change your mind. And for me, this is most definitely one of those occasions. In fact, I would put this up there with my review of the Lexus LC500, because just like that Lexus, the Vanquish has actually, perhaps surprisingly, never been one of my favourite Astons. My favourite Aston Martin remains the Rapide, because I'm a sucker for practical performance cars, but this experience that I had with the car certainly re-evaluated my thoughts of the Vanquish, and I like it a whole lot more than I expected to. And of course the point of the review is to get into why, and especially for a potential buyer to discuss what you can expect from the vehicle and what it can actually offer, because as you saw from the thumbnail, it is a car that you can describe in a couple of different ways. Is it a long-distance GT? Is it a supercar? Is it a super sports car? What is the Vanquish? It's certainly a fantastic rival to something like a Bentley Continental GT, and yet, if you compare the used prices, well, there's a pretty big gap between the two. The Bentleys tend to be shockingly affordable these days, perhaps even a little too much in some cases, and then this car, which has appreciated more and more over the past few years. I'll recall a time not that long ago when the first generation Vanquish, which debuted in 2001, was down to about £50,000 or £60,000. They're not anymore, and the S even more so. Now this car debuted in 2004. And the model in particular which I'm driving is a 2005. Now, as I said, it is a Vanquish S, and for those who are unfamiliar with the differences between the regular Vanquish and this one, regular of course being a very relative term when it comes to an Aston Martin, they both share that 5.9 litre V12 engine, which is an incredible motor, sounds absolutely phenomenal, and you'll be able to hear some of that in the video, and of course you heard some at the start as well. But the power and the torque are very different on the two. Now the weight is also different, as is the performance, but first of all, to touch on the specs, the first generation has 460 horsepower and 400 pound-feet of torque. And of course, it's a naturally aspirated V12, so no supercharger, no turbo. Those are healthy numbers, certainly for 2001, and it was more than enough to get this over 1800 kilo or 1.8 ton GT from 0 to 60 in about 4.5 seconds up to a top speed of 190 miles an hour. Now comes along this one. Power is up from 460 to 520, but they didn't just fall back on a turbo or a small supercharger. No, that's just tuning. Up from 460 to 520 is a healthy increase, as is the difference in torque from 400 pound-feet to 425. Now both cars have a couple of consistent, you could say, downsides that a lot of couch warriors to established magazines tend to criticize them for, and they are the quality of components, which are sometimes shared with Ford and Jaguar, and of course that gearbox. In a similar way to the E60 generation V10 engine BMW M5, it's kind of a standout point of contention on this model. So let's get straight into those two potential downsides. What are my thoughts? Well, first of all, let's talk about quality, because I would wager that the overwhelming majority of people who complain about the interior quality of an Aston Martin in terms of using Jaguar or Ford parts have never been in one, let alone driven one. And it's easy to criticize something that you didn't make and haven't experienced, much like many things in life. I can categorically tell you that when you're in the car, you don't think about, oh, I wonder if this mighty V12 in front of me has maybe some Jaguar parts in there. Or maybe that the seat or the door or some handle or switch might be from a Ford or shared with a Jaguar. You don't think of that for a second, because it's not the point of the car. Because is it technically true that it shares parts with Ford and Jaguar? Well, yes, of course it's technically true. But it's also technically true that a noble M600 has a Volvo engine. It didn't stop it from being one of the greatest performance cars of the 2010s. Likewise here, it's the last thing you think of when you're actually sitting in a Vanquish, and when you're even just seeing one roll by in the flesh, which doesn't happen that often these days. To me, the greatest thing about the Vanquish, especially the S, because obviously it's the even more evolved and fine-tuned version of that 2001 original, is that it essentially takes everything great about that massive 2-ton supercharged Vantage from the 90s, which you also don't see many of these days, and it somehow manages to cram all of that sheer brute force and personality down into something more the kind of size of a DBS or a DB9. And speaking to that generational gap, this is a very significant car to Aston Martin, and even though I hadn't planned it this way, it's actually a very significant car in the history of my reviews as well, because the Vanquish was actually the last model produced at the Newport Pagnell plant. So it was literally the end of an era for Aston Martin. Then, the other Aston that I reviewed, the 2014 Vantage Roadster, was also the end of that era of Aston Martin. So even though I didn't plan it that way, it's kind of nice how those two reviews, in a sense, dovetail into each other. Now, to get back to those specs for just a second, when I referred to the fact that this gets all the spirit of that massive 2-ton Vantage into this much sleeker body, one of the crucial differences is that this is no longer a 2-ton car. In fact, in its S form, this weighs 1,875 kilos, which, let's be honest, is no lightweight, but it's also not trying to be. That's 1.8 tons, technically close to 1.9, so it's not a 2-ton car. And to compare it once again to the Bentley, well, the Bentley Continental GT of this time weighs 2.4 tons. That's a massive difference. In fact, literally half a ton more. The result in performance on this one, considering that advantage in weight over the Bentley, the increase in power and torque over the previous Vanquish, well, it speaks for itself, because this Vanquish actually can hit the double ton. If memory serves, I believe it can even do something like 202 miles an hour. The 0 to 60 doesn't really change that much, partially because of the fact that, again, it's not really designed to be like a hardcore track-only variant. It's still the heart of a GT, inside the body of a supercar, with the spirit of a luxury vehicle, and it's kind of all wrapped together. That is another one of the things that I loved about the Vanquish as well. Whatever you go into driving this car wanting and hoping that it will be, that is exactly what it gives you. If you want this car to be a loud, brutish, extravagant supercar, that's exactly what it is. If you want it to be a surprisingly spacious, but still also surprisingly modestly, from an exterior point of view, sized long-distance GT with great levels of comfort, surprisingly good ride quality, and even seat space and headroom, which I am always looking for in a car, well, it does that as well. However, if you just want a vehicle that looks like an incredible piece of sculpted art on the driveway that you can drive to the Marks & Spencer's car park and make it feel like the Met Gala, well, the Vanquish, of course, can do that as well. And having recently seen a newer black Vanquish doing just that, pulling into a Marks & Spencer's car park near me, I can categorically tell you that it actually doesn't have the same effect when you see that car as when you see one of these on the road. This car simply does have more presence, and it's one of my other favourite things about this car. Something which I kind of already knew it would have, but there are certain things that you have to fully experience to totally appreciate, and that is one of them. The Vanquish feels like a special occasion. When you look at the car, when you stand next to it and look around it, when you sit in it for the first time, of course when you start the engine, and even when you just potter around through a small, cramped little village. Yes, you kind of breathe in, going past parked cars sometimes, but it feels like a very special occasion. It's a car that is, to some degree, kind of a timeless GT, and the market certainly agrees with me there, because the values are still 6 figures on this car. Well, that speaks for itself. A car like this, in my opinion, is only going to stay or appreciate from that level over time. And there are certain other British supercars that's happened to as well. Look at the Jaguar XJ220. Only a few years ago, people couldn't give those away. I remember seeing XJ220s for like 90 grand around 2005, 2006. Now they're 450, 500,000 pounds. I would not be at all surprised if a similar thing happens to the Vanquish. It's already worth great money. I believe it will increase more. For this particular Vanquish that I drove, well, it's a great example. It's led a pampered life, it's been cared for, and you can feel it and tell. You can certainly tell when a high-performance one in particular, has been abused, and this one hasn't, and it's a pretty gorgeous spec as well. I love the Vanquish S in black in particular. I also love it in white, but you don't tend to see many in that colour. To me, it's also the subtle changes in style that make this one better than the first Vanquish as well, because the first one had the groundwork of what of course led to this car's design, but there are some more than subtle changes between the two that really do it for me. The two in particular being the extra chin splitter on the front bumper, which adds to the look and also improves the aerodynamics. The Vanquish S, incidentally, is more aerodynamically efficient than the first generation, and also the boot lid is slightly different, and also consequently changed the position of the brake light from being mounted in the rear window to actually being mounted in the trunk lid. And that little extra ducktail on the back end was of course something which directly inspired Astons that came after this, such as the stunning DBS. Now of course I mentioned the first issue that some people have. That was the potential quality. It's a moot point as far as I'm concerned. Is it something that you can point out? Of course it is. You can point out loads of things about loads of cars if you're that kind of person. If you love the Vanquish, trust me, you're not going to care in the slightest. And that came, as I said, from someone who was previously not a Vanquish fan. So if anyone was going to criticise the car, surely it would be me. But no, I completely overlooked those things because they really don't matter. It's not like something that's going to hang off of the car and break at a certain point. Not at all. It just happens to use parts from different manufacturers. But let's talk about that gearbox, because of course the car is somewhat notorious for that, and that does tend to come from more established names, from Joe Schmo YouTube reviewer all the way up to, car and driver, autocar, whoever it may be. So what are my thoughts on the gearbox? Well, it is an automated manual, as it's called. It's an interesting concept, and it's a concept which, despite the fact that I'm not a huge manual fan anyway, I actually love the laziness of an auto and especially a Tiptronic, I get the idea. It's something which I've even talked about on the Discord server for the channel and in conversation. This idea of, why are we still having this archaic clutch pedal? It just seems so unnecessary to me. I get the fun of changing gear yourself, but the clutch pedal is such an unnecessary thing. Well, Aston Martin answered that, and they did it way back with this car. Now the first generation and this one both have it. I haven't driven the first Vanquish, but I should imagine that this one got it better than that one did. That tends to be what the updates will do. So how does this automated manual actually work? Well, for you as the driver, it doesn't really change much. It's the car itself which tends to have the differences, because it feels in practice very much just like using the flappy paddles on a later sports car, something like an i8 or a newer Maserati, whatever, but it means that the paddles actually control an electronic clutch. So the car doesn't have a clutch pedal, but it does have a clutch. The car controls it for you though. So for instance, if you get below a certain RPM, it will automatically change down, or you can do it yourself. When you bring the car to a stop, the vehicle automatically disengages the clutch for you. Now, in terms of the issues that people could have, I believe it's more to do with how to use the system rather than what the system is. Because there's nothing about what I just said that you could inherently take offense to. Now, what I say now might offend some people, but based on my experience with this car, yes, I can tell that it would take a little bit of time to get used to it. But even in the time that I spent in the vehicle, my changes were already getting much smoother, and I understood the principles behind the gearbox and how to use it. So based on my experience, the only conclusion I can draw is that a lot of the people who criticise the car don't really know how to drive a manual. And that kind of sounds harsh, but I don't see any other conclusion that can be made, because to me it's not complicated at all to use this machine. Now getting it perfect is something else, but let's be honest, people who criticise this car in favour of a traditional manual with clutch probably don't exactly make perfect gear changes themselves, so it's easy to criticise something that you haven't built yourself. As far as I'm concerned, I think it's a great idea for a gearbox, and that's coming from once again somebody who is an auto fan. I'm lazy all the way and love the car doing everything for you. However, if you do want the experience of a manual without the, let's be honest, outdated idea of a clutch pedal, well, this car does that for you, and I think it's really cool that Aston even attempted to do that. They could have just shoved a regular auto in there, which probably wouldn't have aged well, or they could have gone with a traditional 6-speed manual. And yes, I'm sure there are people who love that and would probably choose it. Maybe so. but I actually admire the fact that they tried something very different to what most people were doing, and, especially for a car of its age, pulled it off really well. Because the first generation, as I said, also had this system, and that was in 2001. 2001 is not a good time for many cars. The early 2000s really are a reckoning for certain vehicles holding up or not holding up to the test of time, and as far as I'm concerned, this one does. The design certainly has not aged badly at all. It's still an incredible collector's piece, and for those who are Aston aficionados, well, of course you don't need me to tell you that this really is a significant car for Aston. In terms of collectability, it's a great one. It is a car that you can use every day if you want to. I'm not going to go ahead and say that the rear seats are spacious, the trunk can fit everything you need, and that the fuel economy is amazing. Because, of course, it's a supercar, so it would be kind of ridiculous to expect those things. But I will say that they did a fantastic job of making it feel even close to as good as it actually does. And as I mentioned earlier on, it delivers everything you would want an Aston Martin to feel like. It feels robust, surprisingly so in fact. It's not rattly or rickety or feels like something's going to break at any moment at all. It feels like a essentially British muscle car wrapped in a supercar body, and I love it for that. But overall, that's it for my thoughts on the Vanquish. Of course, if you are new to the channel, be sure to click the link on screen to check out my car reviews, or my motorcycle reviews if that's what you're into as well. And of course, follow the channel for more reviews in future. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.